My name is Andrew Maskrey. I'm the coordinating lead author of the CDRI Biennial Report on Global Infrastructure Resilience. This is the first edition of a report that's going to come out every 2 years. The report we think is quite unique because it really is probably one of the first reports that's come out internationally but really looks at this big issue of infrastructure resilience. The report starts off by really looking at the challenge of infrastructure resilience. And this is a challenge that's particularly faced by developing countries. In the report, we talk about low and middle income countries. So these are in a sense, the world's poorer countries. We discuss also high income countries in the report, but the report's really aimed at countries like India and its colleagues and its pars in the world, who are countries which still have a lot of issues to address in infrastructure. So probably one of the first issues that countries need to address is actually having more infrastructure. Clearly in high-income countries that's not an issue, but I mean in middle-income countries like India, and particularly in low-income countries like many of the sub-Saharan African countries, there's still a huge infrastructure deficit. When we say infrastructure deficit, that means that people don't necessarily have access to the services, the essential services they need: transport, water, power, health, education, all the things that infrastructure provides and which are really important for social development. And the other thing we point out in the report is that infrastructure is also really important for economic development. The first point we make is we need more investment in infrastructure in low and middle income countries. And the gap between those countries and high-income countries is not a small gap, it's actually a very big gap. If we took the difference between the low-income countries and the high-income countries, the amount of value of infrastructure per person is about 1 to 15. So it's like saying if I have, as a person in India, 1 unit of infrastructure, someone in Japan has 15 units of infrastructure. So the gap can be very, very big. The second issue we then look at, though, is problems of what we call infrastructure governance. So what does that mean? Infrastructure governance basically means the capacity of countries and particularly of governments to be able to plan, manage, finance, operate and maintain their infrastructure systems. Particularly if infrastructure systems aren't well maintained and properly operated, they suffer from what we call premature obsolescence. So if I design, for example, a new bridge, maybe as the engineer I'm designing that bridge with a life I'm expecting it to last for the next 70 years. But if it's not properly maintained, if we don't invest in maintenance, maybe that bridge after 30 years is already starting to fall down or can't take the weight of the traffic over it and would need to be rebuilt. So a second problem a lot of developing countries have is their infrastructure is not of very good quality. Normally only 15 or 20% is the cost of actually building it in the first place. 70 or 80% is the cost of maintaining it over those 40, 50, 70 years. So that's a second challenge we've identified faced by, again, low and middle income countries. A third challenge has to do, and this is really perhaps the crux of this report, has to do with disaster and climate risk. So this is the effect on infrastructure of hazard events related to both geological hazards. Geological hazards can be earthquakes, tsunamis, or the landslides that are triggered by earthquakes, as well as the climate hazards. Climate hazards are, for example, tropical cyclones, wind and storm surge, flood, drought, and so on and so forth. So unfortunately, again, in high-income countries, usually the infrastructure is built to quite high, what we call resilience standards. So it's able to withstand these kind of events without suffering loss and damage. In poorer countries, and again, it's linked to this issue of inadequate maintenance, often the infrastructure is neither designed or maintained in a way that it can resist hazard events. So fortunately, it's the poorer countries, the countries that most need new infrastructure investment, that are actually losing the most in relative terms. So it's it's actually a very, in a sense, it's quite a difficult situation. It's a bit like a vicious circle. So that's when we say in the report, that's when there's a phrase actually we use in the first paragraph, which I really like. So we obviously need a lot more new investment, but if we don't at the same time actually strengthen the resilience of the infrastructure, that new investment's like pouring water into a bamboo basket. It's not like pouring it into an earthenware pot, in which case the water stays there. We pour it into a bamboo basket and it goes out again. So if we're in a situation where we desperately need this new investment to actually get rid of this infrastructure deficit we have, but if of our existing infrastructure we're losing 5 or 10% every year due to disaster damage or disaster loss, what happens is the little money we have to invest in new infrastructure, we end up having to spend it on repairing, patching up, rehabilitating and rebuilding our existing infrastructure. So unfortunately, because of this situation, sort of the gap between the high-income countries and the low-income countries isn't actually getting narrower, it's actually still getting wider. And this is really the gap that CDRI is trying to address, and this is this gap that the report addresses. We then look at just 2 more issues at the beginning of the report. One is what we call systemic risk and systemic resilience. And this has to do with issues like climate change, loss of biodiversity, and some of the other global challenges we have. The way we've been building infrastructure over the last 50 years, unfortunately, is very carbon intensive. So it's not just going to be affected by climate change, it's actually a cause of climate change. It's a cause of loss of biodiversity. It's a cause of sort of inefficient urban layouts and many other things. So the other challenge that countries have is, if they didn't need more challenges, is to also change the way they're building infrastructure. That's something that's already happening. I mean, we've seen here in India the major shift, for example, from fossil fuel power generation to renewables. There's a gradual shift happening in transport from internal combustion engines to electric, etc. But the countries are also going to see how they can manage this process of transition, because a lot of the developing countries are also going to end up with what we call stranded assets. Let me explain that term. A stranded asset is, for example, if I'd invested a lot in oil pipelines throughout the country, but suddenly all my transport starts moving onto electric, I'm left with all these oil pipelines with nothing to do. Now, if I'm in a weak economic situation, it's like having yet another set of liabilities. So to summarize, in a sense, the challenge the report is looking at, it's a 3-fold challenge. One is getting more investment and more infrastructure. Secondly, making sure that infrastructure is resilient. And 3, really moving on this transition to what we call net zero, low carbon economies. Now, to in a sense, to provide evidence to support all that, what we've built in the report, and this we built through a consortium, a global consortium of scientific institutions, is something called GIRI, G-I-R-I. GIRI stands for the Global Infrastructure Risk Model and Index. So what does GIRI do? GIRI basically is what we call a risk model. It uses exactly the same, let's say, advanced modeling techniques and technology, but it's used by the insurance industry. So it's a really, really cutting-edge model. But the difference between what the insurance industry does and what GIRI is going to do is the insurance industry makes models for itself. So they can fix your insurance premium. When you go to insure your house or your business, they'll tell you it costs this much. They don't tell you how they modeled that, they just give you the bill. So we're going to do exactly the same. We're not going to do it, we've actually now done it. But in a way that all that information is going to be available to the public, it's going to be available to governments, it's going to be available to investors. So it actually, by making this information fully available to everyone, we're hoping this can actually help to change behavior in the way we actually take decisions, and particularly investment decisions in infrastructure. So GIRI, what we've done is, first of all, we built a spatial database of all the infrastructure in the world. Now that sounds a crazy plan, but we actually did it. So every road, railway, bridge, tunnel, power station, high tension power line, port, airport, telecom tower, health infrastructure, education infrastructure has been mapped. And not just mapped in one country, I said mapped worldwide. We then looked at all the places that can be affected by hazards. So there's, it's mapped, calculated all the tectonic faults, all the areas where earthquakes can happen, which are the coastlines that can be exposed to tsunamis, which are the flood exposed areas, which are the areas where cyclones can happen. And this is done looking at both the frequency and the intensity of the event. So it's done to say, the model can tell us that in this part of India or this part of any country in the world, this is the probability of you suffering a intensity 7 earthquake, or this is the probability of being affected by a force 4 cyclone in the next 10 years. So we have all that information. We have all the information on what's exposed. And then we also have information on the vulnerability of what's exposed. The vulnerability tells us it's a mathematical function which tells us the probability of being damaged, the amount of damage we can have. So if I want to say I have a power station in a seismic area, I need to have a function which tells me if an earthquake of this magnitude happens, what's the probability of loss and damage in that power station. So with that massive information, we're talking here about terabytes and terabytes and terabytes of information and a huge amount of computing capacity. All that information is crunched. So we then have information on the probable levels of loss. In the report it's called the average annual loss that any country can happen, any country can experience for any infrastructure sector in any part of its territory. So if we think of this as almost like a 3-dimensional matrix or a cube, you can in a sense query, my country, this infrastructure sector, and this hazard, and it will give us a loss figure. It will actually give us a figure, like this is on average how much you're going to lose a year. And this is really important information for governments they currently do not have. What happens, as I think everyone knows, disasters don't happen regularly every year. It's not that we get an earthquake a month every year. We may get 10 years with no earthquakes, and then we might get 50 years of earthquake losses in one day. This has happened in India. In India you've had the Maharashtra earthquake, the Gujarat earthquake, but you don't have big earthquakes every year. So the advantage of modeling this thing, it turns it into an average annual loss. So that if I'm the owner of all this infrastructure, and most of the infrastructure is publicly owned, in this country most of it's owned by the government of India, this tells me how many liabilities I'm actually owning. Yeah? And if I know my liabilities, that's like saying this is the amount of money I should be setting aside every year to cover for losses. So this is really, I'm not exaggerating here, so this is the first time ever anyone has ever done this. So this is really going to be one of the sort of crown jewels of CDRI, and it's all going to be made available, there's going to be summarized in the report, but it's going to be made available on an interactive data platform. So anyone can go into the platform and analyze the information, visualize it, and download it and pull out the information they need. The report then looks at another very interesting area, which is called nature-based infrastructure solutions. And this is something that's been bubbling in the background for decades. It's not new. And in fact, if we go back into the history of our ancient cultures, be those in this area of Asia and India, in China, in the Andes, in North Africa, in Europe, many of the ancient cultures actually worked with nature extremely successfully to meet their needs of water and other things. Unfortunately, as I said, the way we've been building infrastructure in the last 50 years has been using more and more basically concrete and steel. It's been a very aggressive approach, and it's actually been one of the major causes of climate change, which is now a global problem. So there's an increasing use of what we call nature-based infrastructure solutions. It's like working with nature instead of working against nature, which can actually really solve a lot of problems in some of the infrastructure sectors. I don't think we've come up with nature-based telecommunications infrastructure yet, but in terms of certainly water, wastewater, and also preventive infrastructure, for example, protecting areas from floods and storm surges, this can be extremely useful. So we have a whole section in the report in which we've looked at how this actually works, what are the advantages. Often it costs far less than conventional infrastructure, needs less to maintain, and interestingly it gets better over time instead of getting worse. I mean, if I build a seawall to protect where I live against storm surges or tsunamis, that seawall will need more and more maintenance and more expense over the years to continue its strength, to continue its functionality. Mangroves will maybe start off not offering much protection, but the advantage is they actually get stronger and stronger and stronger each year. So we've actually looked, I think quite, rationally at what is the potential for using nature-based infrastructure solutions, in which sectors they can be used, but in which sectors they don't really help at all, the advantages they bring, but also what countries need to actually make these things turn from quite sort of exotic pilot projects, which is the situation now, into something where they really become mainstream. And this sometimes boils down to, some quite nitty-gritty things. Just to give one example, if I'm an engineer, any infrastructure project at some point in time has to have a signature of a professional, a qualified engineer, to say this is up to the standards. But for nature-based infrastructure solutions, there's often no standards. So the engineer probably wouldn't be willing to sign because it would increase his professional liability. So that's just an example. We need standards for these things so we can actually really start using them. And then to finalize the report, the last chapter is, again, all the chapters are important, but this is one of the most critical ones. We look at the whole area of infrastructure finance. If we didn't have the section on infrastructure finance, it could be a very nice academic report, very interesting for people to read, but wouldn't actually change anything. Because if this is going to change, we have to bring finance into the picture. The current situation is maybe a little bit bleak. We've worked out some estimates of how much money is going to be needed to do three things. One is to close this infrastructure gap so that people have the infrastructure they need and achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. The second is the transition to net zero, we've discussed. And the third is to strengthen resilience, we've also discussed. But then we've compared that to the amount of existing investment going into infrastructure in low and middle income countries. And the difference again is around 10 to 1, in a sense that the needs are 10 times greater than what's currently on the table. So we have a need now to somehow see how we can mobilize not just a little bit more finance for this, but actually a huge amount of new finance for this. And particularly, as I said, it's not just finance for infrastructure, it's finance for resilient infrastructure. So the report then looks at, different ways in which this can happen. Making the economic case for resilience isn't difficult. If we add up the benefits of resilience, avoided loss and damage, avoided service disruptions, better social indicators, better economic indicators, etc. All those benefits can add up to 3 or 4 times more than what it would cost to invest in resilience. So from an economic perspective, it's very easy to make the argument, it's very easy to make the case. Making the financial case or the political case is much more difficult. So this is really going to depend on bringing much more private investment into the infrastructure space. And to bring the private investment in, we have to find some way of sharing what we call the resilience dividend. The report's actually called capturing the resilience dividend. We have to find some way of monetizing that, turning all these benefits of avoided loss and damage, avoided service disruption, better social indicators, etc., putting monetary values on them, working out how much that's worth, and then distributing some of that dividend back to the investors. Because if the investors don't have an incentive to invest, they won't invest. So we've gathered together case material from different parts of the world, whether it's been possible to do this in different sectors. And we've put forward in the report, I mean, it's not a blueprint, but we put forward, let's say, different pathways which we think countries can explore, which should enable them to mobilize, you know, a lot of different funds. And I think what we'll look forward to after the report is hopefully entering into dialogues, or CDRI can then enter into dialogues with some of its member countries to actually start trying some of these things out. So I mean, some of the ideas, for example, one of the reasons that investors don't invest is countries only have, you know, random sets of small projects. No one's interested. Bundling all those projects together into what we call a project pipeline, spread over 5 or 10 years, can suddenly provide a much more, you know, attractive vehicle for investors to invest into. If countries established, we're proposing national resilience funds, putting some public money in to, in a sense, de-risk the process. Again, can then allow climate finance, public finance, private finance, insurance all to come together to again provide, perhaps we hope, a very sort of attractive environment for investors wanting to invest. We then looked at, I mean, all the different instruments that are out. We're increasing new instruments coming online all the time, resilience bonds, green bonds, and so on and so forth, which can provide these things. And we have a model in what's called payment for ecosystem services, which many countries are already using, in which the sort of part of these resilience benefits can actually go back to the people who are actually providing the resilience. So, as I said, we haven't given a blueprint in the report saying this is what has to happen, but we've shown a number of pathways. So the job of CDRI, I think, after this report is then persuading some of its members to actually start walking down some of these pathways, and that's our objective. Thank you very much for your patience and attention.